Now, a method can function excellently under certain conditions or given certain assumptions, but if you change the assumptions, the result can be devastating. And so the question is, are there situations where the points of departure, the assumptions made in the ways of calculating QALYs, can be counterintuitive? And Kristian Bolin will help us to illuminate that question or answer that question.
Hi everyone. You can hear me. I also want to start by thanking Göran inviting me here to talk about quality-adjusted life years and ethical principles. Are there any conflicts? How do I press the... Is this one? Yeah. Okay. And I can somewhat leap ahead of myself in revealing that, yes, there are conflicts. And I will demonstrate this by means of a couple of simple examples. And I will not focus on so much on the technical details in the computation of a quality-adjusted life year. But I will instead focus on one property of its construct, namely the focus on gains, really, independently on where you are to start with. No? So we know, and Emily has described this for us, that quality-adjusted life years are really used in practice as a measure for prioritizing among competing uses of resources in the healthcare sector. And I've already answered the question, does any conflict arise between approaches and ethical principles? The answer to that question is yes, and I will demonstrate that, as I said, by means of 2 or 3 simple examples. And the examples is constructed assuming that we have 2 types of patients. One type is assumed to have a serious health condition with a very low quality of life. And the other type of patients have a non-serious health condition, or at least less serious health condition, with a somewhat reduced quality of life. And examples of the first set of diseases might be terminal cancers, multiple sclerosis, ALS, epilepsy, diabetes, COPD, and other non-serious health conditions might be, for instance, inflammatory bowel disease, the mild kind, simple colds and flus, and stuff like that. So, even though Emily gave an account of how to calculate QALY, I'm a person that likes to think in pictures, so I think about QALYs as being represented by an area. If you have a diagram with the quality of life on the vertical axis and you have life years on the horizontal axis, the number of QALYs is really represented by the area of the rectangle. In this simple case, you will have 1 life year at a slightly reduced quality of life, which means that the number of QALYs is simply 1 multiplied by the figure 0.8 that I use here. So the number of QALYs is 0.8 in this case. Of course, there are several ethical principles that we might consider, but I've taken as a point of departure the ethical principles that shall be a foundation for how healthcare resources are prioritized within the Swedish healthcare sector. And as we have heard, we have the principle of human dignity, we have the principle of need and solidarity, and we have the principle of cost effectiveness. And as I said, my proposition is that the principle of cost effectiveness using the QALY approach may be in conflict with both of these ethical principles. And it's As you will see, it's rather obvious to demonstrate that. When we apply the QALY-based approach to prioritization, we really perform cost-effectiveness analysis. They imply that what's important here is the gain of quality-adjusted life years between two competing treatments. And that is what governs the prioritization between different uses of healthcare resources, according to the cost-effectiveness principle at least. So that would be a problem, as I will show, because the focus of the QALY-based method on QALY gains really means that we don't consider the situation without treatment. We don't pay any respect to that. And moreover, a greater capacity to benefit from a given treatment is favored over a less pronounced capacity to benefit from a treatment. And third, gained life years are valued more for those in good health than for those in poorer health. As a first example, I think about or assume an intervention or a treatment which has no effect on length of life, but it provides health-related utility gains that are normally the same, independently of the initial health state. And to put some figures on this situation, I assume that the individual with the non-serious health state has a health-related utility to start with 0.7. And the serious health state persons, those types, has a much lower health-related utility, 0.1 to start with, without the treatment. And we assume that the treatment adds 0.1 units of utility to each group. And in order to, well, have some figures easy to calculate with, we assume that the length of life is 10 years, or the effect of the treatment or the intervention is 10 years. So 10 years is really the time frame that we have. In the first case, remember we have a treatment with no effect on length of life. We have the treatment is given to the person with a slightly reduced quality of life. That means that without the treatment, the lower rectangle is an illustration of the quality, the number of QALYs that person would have. And the sum of the upper rectangle and the lower rectangle, the total rectangle, is a measure of the number of QALYs when that type of person are provided with the intervention or treatment. And we can see that in the first case we end up with the number 7, in the other case we end up with the number 8. That means that the gain in number of QALYs is simply 1. So let's turn to the person or the patient or the group of patients less good off. In that case we will have to start with without the treatment, the number of QALYs will be the lower rectangle, and as in the previous case, with the treatment, the sum of the two rectangles will be signifying the number of QALYs with the treatment. And as we can see in this case, without the treatment, the persons with the poor health state will have a number of QALYs equal to 1, and with the treatment, the number of QALYs will be equal to 2. Which means that the gains are really equal. Then I have, and I'm not sure that we need to, but maybe this is good, because This really shows how you can calculate this without using the concept of rectangles. We have 10 years. For each year, we have a health-related quality of life with treatment of 0.8. So we end up with 10 times 0.8, which is 8. And without the treatment, in a similar fashion, we end up with 7. And exactly the same calculations for the individuals with poorer health. So, gains are equal, even though the QALYs without treatments differs. So even though the patients or the group of patients have radically different situations to start with, we cannot, given the assumption of the two interventions, the two treatments having equal costs, we cannot distinguish between what we shall do here. And I think this is in conflict with the ethical principle of need and solidarity. It's an obvious conflict with that principle. And moreover, there are some empirical studies suggesting that society would prefer interventions that target those worse off. So really the empirical findings are more aligned with the ethical principle of need and solidarity than the results that you get from the cost effectiveness calculations using the QALY approach. So the other example is, and I continue to consider the two groups of patients, but in this case we will have a treatment which expands on the expected number of life years that you will have. So for the the healthy or the relatively healthy individual, we will add 5 life years with the treatment at a health-related quality of life at 0.7, which means that without the treatment we end up with 7 as before. With the treatment we end up with 10.5 QALYs. And this is for the sort of more well-off group of patients. But in the case of those who are less well-off health-wise, in that case you will also add 5. You have the same treatment effect. You will add 5 life years. But those will be valued as the difference between 1 and 1.5, whereas in the previous case, those will be valued as the difference between 10, 0.5, and 7. So we will put a higher value on the life gains, the gains in life years for those in better health. Of course, if you have different costs for the treatment, this would complicate matters. But nevertheless, I think this also is in conflict with the ethical principle of solidarity and need. We can change the scenario slightly, considering 2 individuals with about the same health condition, but let's pretend now or assume that they differ in their capacity to benefit from a given treatment. Then in that case, performing the same calculations, the QALY approach would give priority to the treatment of the patient who gained the most, which, in my mind, stands in conflict with both the ethical principle of human dignity and the principle of need and solidarity in this case. And also, empirical studies in this case suggest that society does not prefer interventions targeted to those with a higher capacity to benefit. So again, the principle of cost effectiveness using the QALY approach in this kind of situation would potentially end up with an area of conflict between what the cost-effectiveness approach prescribes, and the two other ethical principles. Yes. So, what can we do about that? Well, there is a debate, scientific debate in economics and in health economics, which I think can be boiled down to you can sort of adjust the quality approach by putting additional weights to the utility weights, taking, for instance, severity of illness and capacity to benefit into account in a more proper way, or at least in a way that would not leave the cost-effectiveness measure using the quality approach stand in such obvious conflict with the other ethical principles. But I think that this seems to limit the quality approach to comparisons between similar patients. And that, again, is not what the quality-adjusted life year, the objective of the quality-adjusted life year to start with wasn't that. I mean, one of the main objectives was to get sort of an exchange rate in order to make prioritizations between groups of patients. And that, there is really where the problem arises. If you allow me to be an economist now for a few seconds, a welfarist approach could potentially take this into account by measuring and allowing for stronger preferences for health, improvements for those in poor health, and differences in preferences for extra years into account. And the question is, how can one achieve that? And it's inherently difficult to perform such studies. If I continue to be an economist, you need, in order to the welfare approach to function, you need sort of flawless markets. And you never have that really here. One example, which is maybe nearby, is a market for life-saving devices. For instance, there are a lot of studies in the traffic road area in which you study the demand for and the willingness to pay for devices in cars that sort of decreases the risk for dying in the car accident. And you can use that kind of studies to implicitly infer the willingness to pay for an additional statistical life. But I mean, in the healthcare sector, you don't have that situation really. You don't have markets. You can't really observe prices and demand in the way that you need to do to truly apply a welfarist approach. So my conclusions are that the quality approach is in potential conflict with ethical principles for prioritization in the healthcare sector. And my personal reflection on this is particularly pronounced when you use it as a measure for prioritization between therapeutical areas. It's much less obvious if you use it for the prioritization between similar patients given a specific disease, for instance. That may imply that, I mean, most of the decisions made, for instance, by TLV, most of the decisions made were not to include new pharmaceuticals into the reimbursement system. May be belonging to sort of the studies in which you compare treatments within therapeutical areas. So it may be that the problem is less pronounced for the majority of cost-effectiveness studies that are really used right now. But once you expand the area of application into, for instance, devices, into new complex medical interventions, you, I think, will inevitably end up with having conflicts between principles. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kristian, for this excellent overview. I think it was very interesting that you problemized. You focused on the gains and problemized that, and you used very instructive diagrams in terms of areas, geometric diagrams, to illustrate your points. I have a question for you, and concerning the remedies that you outlined. You said they could be the problems could be dealt with by introducing additional weights. Could you say something about?
That has been suggested.
Yes.
Not by me, though.
No, but could that be done in a non-arbitrary way? Could you comment on that?
I mean, ultimately, you have to rely on the same kind of studies that lay the ground for the utility weight that we already have. So my thought is you will end up with the same kind of methodological problems, the one that Emily presented and Nils-Erik was discussing, I think.
Yeah. All right. Questions, comments, answer, please.
Hello, Patrick Nylander again. I thank you for the presentation. I think it opens up for might be too a wide discussion, but it has to do with what the material that is provided to the decision maker is supposed to take into account, and how much of complete other considerations that should be pushed into a material that is not supposed to handle those kind of considerations, and how much is to be left to the decision maker to make decisions about that is not included in what is delivered to the decision maker. There are several ways to do this. I mean, you could try to adjust the methods that you are using to make them take account to other issues than they are supposedly constructed to take account of, or you could use other methods to take into account dimensions that are not included in the original methodology, like QALYs. This discussion has also been around in the transportation sector, where I used to be before, whether you should use weights or even try to remodel the whole approach to take into account other ethical considerations than the value of statistical life. So it sort of opens up for the discussion of the role of the expert, how much should be, how much of the material delivered from the expert should govern the decisions, and how much is to be left to the decision maker itself.
Decision maker, institutionalized decision maker. Is that what we're talking? Is it the institutions we're talking about? For instance, reimbursement decisions. Is that what you?
I'm talking about institutions could be politicians, of course, should be decision makers.
So, do you want me to comment on what you said?
One comment, one thing would be to comment on, do you think it is a good way, because the discussion that's been in the transportation sector, at least as long as I was there, was the discussion between keeping the method clean, to keep the cost-benefit analysis method clean from other considerations, not to adjust it, or to adjust it to take into account other considerations than efficiency.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not an expert in how the if we take the examples of reimbursement of drugs, because it seems like a illustrative example, on how those decisions are made. But we can look at the results. And I mean, the sort of informal threshold of the cost effectiveness ratio, I mean, the number of kronos paid for an additional quality-adjusted life year varies between therapeutical areas. I mean, the informal threshold is 500,000 kronos, something like that. But still, you have, to take a style as example, treatment for hemophilia in children, for instance, was subsidized. I can't remember the exact figures on the cost-effectiveness ratio, but it can be counted in numbers of millions of kronos. And in my mind, that means that the decision makers have really used the lexicographical ordering of the principles here, and invoked either the first or the second principle in order to make a decision. So the cost-effectiveness principle has not been allowed to guide this.
All right, Lars Sandman.
Yes, thank you. Maybe it's a question or comment on a similar theme, because it seems to me I'm part of one of these decisional boards, the NT Council, the Council for New Therapies, and when we are trying to apply the ethical platform, we sort of invoke the other principles to balance the cost-effectiveness ratio we get, sort of the calculation we get. So, in a sense, we have different thresholds for different severities. So our threshold, perhaps, as in TLV, for the most severe diseases, is in the range of 1 million or 1 million plus per QALY. And then lower when we have less severe diseases. We look explicitly at the effects of the treatment, not just on the calculated sort of QALY rate. So we look behind the QALY, what kind of effect is it? We have started to look at the rarity of the condition to see if we should sort of accept a higher threshold on rare conditions, given the background development cost, etc. So I think, in a sense, I mean, I agree with you that if we would only apply the QALY or the cost effectiveness using QALY, we would have these ethical problems. But since we balance the QALY ratio with these different other aspects taken into consideration, it seems like we are actually handling these problems, perhaps not perfectly, and perhaps to some extent we're not consistent. We try to be consistent by looking back on our decisions, etc. But what's your comment on that?
Well, I agree with you to some extent, or to a large extent, which I think I argued previously. But I mean, let's assume that things in practice work out nicely, and really the cost effectiveness, the principle of cost effectiveness, is more or less entirely used within the same therapeutical areas. That means that the priority decisions will be made within a given set of diseases or therapeutical areas. But in most cost effectiveness studies, the cost of implementing a new therapy isn't taken into account. The only thing that the cost effectiveness ratio tells you about it is the additional cost per QALY if you implement it. But if you are considering a given therapeutical area, where should that resources come from? You have two sources, really. Then you have, for the first one, you have to go outside that therapeutical area. You have to take funding or resources from some other area, and then you will lose treatment effects for some other patients. Or you have to get more funding, raise taxes, and that also comes with a deadweight loss. So even though you might be handling it in the way that I think we agree about, you will end up with problems, which those problems might not be strictly confined to the construct of the QALY, but it stemmed from that somehow. That's my comment, I think.
Right. Emily?
Thank you very much, Kristian, for this very interesting presentation. I was just thinking, because I've been involved in discussions about production loss, for example, in health economic evaluations, and how this relates to the principles. And like, for example, if we take production loss into account, how that relates to the human dignity principle. And in that case, I think the main problem was that as health economists, we were not transparent with the analysis we did. We didn't show that much how it actually influenced the results, which made it difficult for the decision makers to think about how to handle that when they made the decisions. So, and I'm just wondering, because I think we could do a better job being more transparent about the different ethical problems that relates to the health economic evaluation without changing the health economic evaluation. And sometimes I'm missing this kind of ethical analysis in relation to the results of the economic evaluation. But do you think it could be useful to be more transparent and be more transparent with the ethical problems and the implications of those to help the decision makers being able handle these issues when they make the decisions? Because I mean, I think it would be a problem if we started weighting things in the analysis, because then it would become less transparent. Do you understand what I mean? I'm just wondering, do you think we could do something to actually help the decision makers in this case?
I don't want to be a bore when I give my answer, but I don't think transparency is the problem here. The problem is, but because alluding to the previous discussion, I think that what we can observe suggests that the authorities pretty much do a good work given the tools that they are handled. So my answer must be no. I don't think increased transparency in this case would sort of relieve some of the problems that we have been discussing. I don't think so. Then you said something about productivity. Did I hear that? How does that relate to? Do you mean whether or not we should include productivity?
No, what I mean is that it can also have some problems, or it does not go very well with the human dignity principle all the time.
Okay.
So then just by showing how it influences the results by including it, I'm not saying that we should exclude it, but just showing how it affects the results can help the decision makers know how to handle it. Or
maybe I understood you wrong, but I mean, I'm not sure everybody aware, but I think Sweden is about one of the few, maybe the only country in the world where so-called productivity effects should be included in the cost effectiveness analysis when you make priority decisions. And productivity effects are indirect effects. You can, for instance, by a treatment, reduce sickness absenteeism. You can prolong life, you can prolong working life. But the main critique against doing that is that you will get a discrimination towards the elderly, because you only include labor market related productivity. And that's because you don't have information on household production. If you had that, you would for sure had figures on the value of production for those who are retired from the labor market. And if in the world where you have perfect information, you would certainly not need to, but it would be a good thing to include those values as well. But I don't. What is the status today? Is that how the cost effectiveness analysis should be performed still? Yeah. Okay.
I'd like to say that I agree with both of you, but on different issues.
Okay.
So I agree with your criticism of counting indirect costs, because that will mean that some people will be punished twice. If you're out of job, then you will get lower, worse treatment. But I agree with Emily in that you should add ethical considerations to the healthcare economics and try to make the two meet. And in my introductory talk, I mentioned a few ethical problems raised by these calculations, and that was a shorter version. I have a longer version with more ethical problems, but within 20 minutes, there's a limit to how much you can say. So I agree that's the way to go forward, but I'm very skeptical about using indirect costs in these calculations for the reason that Kristian mentioned and for some other reasons as well. But I know that TLV and some others are very keen on that. I think they should stop. All right. Any further comments or questions? Please.
Just comment to Emily. I think, and this is again from my experiences from the transportation sector, where the decision makers may not be as, I don't know, ethically interested. I think there's a problem. There is a demand for simplicity in the material that is given to the decision maker. So if there are other aspects to be considered than efficiency, then as an expert, please can you try to include them in your material so that we don't have to use time and resources in trying to elaborate on them, because we don't have the time or the resources to do that. That's on one side, and you are favoring more of to make them explicit to the decision maker, which I would prefer too. But I can see the problem with doing that.
All right. Any further comments? Then we'll move on to the next speaker.